actually degrading for not only for the victims but also for those who practice torture.
Mark, one of the arguments we hear is that it is just as likely to provide bad information because people will say anything to avoid pain. How accurate is that?
I think that's true, and I think it's one of the big reasons why any information obtained in any kind of a coercive setting should never be allowed in a court of law to prosecute someone, because the idea is not to force somebody to confess to doing something, but there's no doubt that there are people and there are instances who will respond and give up information if they're frightened, if they're made uncomfortable, if they're tortured. That it doesn't always work, and in many cases it's the wrong way to go, but I think this would be a very easy issue if it were simply true that torture and coercion don't work. It does work. I can give you examples of it working.
It does work, or it can work?
It can work, and it has worked, and it does work in some cases.
Melissa?
Well, I would be interested in hearing some of the examples of the cases where it is supposed to have worked. You know, it is, as Mark mentioned, that often the case that the information that gets extracted from people who are being tortured is unreliable. That is, sometimes it is true and sometimes it's not true. Sometimes people under torture will throw the interrogators the names of people who have done them some harm in order to give them some name and give them a wild goose chase to run off on. So the real question is not whether true information is sometimes extracted through torture, but whether torture is a more effective means of getting accurate information than other standard interrogation and investigative techniques.
So would you say a blanket prohibition, it never ought to be used?
A blanket prohibition on torture? I am all in favor of a blanket prohibition.
Okay, let me give you the stereotypical example then. You've got Al-Qaeda. You've got some guy who's with Al-Qaeda. He's sitting there. You know that there's been a bomb planted at the base of the Empire State Building. You know he knows about it. There's 8,000 people going to die if you don't get the information from him in the next hour. You haven't got time to pussyfoot around. Are you open to torture in that circumstance?
That is the classic ticking bomb scenario. And I really would be interested to hear if any of our panelists can give us some real-life examples where such a scenario has actually been played out in real life. There are some standard examples that people march out to say, you know, this was a real ticking bomb scenario and we used torture in this case and it worked and we got the information we needed. But if you examine those in detail, it often seems to turn out to be the case that actually it wasn't either the torture wasn't what got the information from the person, or there were other ways of getting the same information that didn't involve torture.
Rick, do you have any information on this that could help us one way or the other?
Nothing that dramatic, but I have seen, let's call them enhanced interrogation techniques. And I'll use your example. I've seen solitary confinement break a detainee in about 3 days. So if you've got 3 days, you can do it. A complete sensory deprivation. There are countries in the Middle East that do this quite effectively and don't resort to any other physical force than that. And I've seen them completely break down and extract reliable information. Now, just because someone throws out a name, that's not intelligence. That's information, and you have to corroborate that with other sources. So most of the time, if you've got one guy from Al-Qaeda and that's your only source of information, you can't rely on what he tells you because you've got no way to corroborate it with something else. But if you've got electronic intercepts, if you've got emails, if you've got somebody else you can bounce that information off, you play one against the other. That's when it can work. But you never take someone's answer under any circumstances, even under the psychological approaches. You always have to corroborate that information with something else. So, you know, it can be reliable if you do it right.
I'm going to ask our director to roll some tape now that is not for the faint of heart. So if there are any kids, young people near the television set right now, this might be a good time to tell them to look away. And I suspect everybody in this room knows about Amnesty International. They have put forward an advertising campaign right now in order to ban torture. And this is one of the ads they have produced in that effort. Michael, roll tape.
How you doing? Yeah? All right. How was school? Good girl. I'll be back soon. Sure, just a couple of days. Listen, sweetheart, can you do me a favor, huh? Can you go to the window and blow Daddy a kiss? Can you do that? I love you too.
How accurate is that?
That's pretty accurate. That's a stress position followed by an open-handed belly slap, both of which were authorized under the guidelines. In fact, they're still current for the CIA.
Is that torture?
I don't think so.
Mark, is that torture?
Absolutely. But torture is something that you can't, I think, draw a clear line between coercive methods like stress position, sleep deprivation, and torture where you're gouging people's eyes out and doing horrible, physical acts to them. The problem is that any effort made to draw a clear line differentiating coercion from torture will fall apart, because even something as simple as a stress position can become torture if it's used long enough, if the circumstances are altered. In Israel, they attempted to authorize relatively moderate coercive methods, shaking people, slapping people, and they ended up shaking people to death, slapping people to death. So no, you can't make a clear differentiation between coercion and torture. You have to simply wrestle with the issue of whether there's ever an instance where you feel compelled to try to force someone to tell you something.
The ads really push a hot button also, in as much as, here's this guy on his phone asking his daughter to blow him a kiss, which he does on the one hand, and then seconds later he's able to inflict, punishment at the very least on somebody else. Did you ever run into that kind of situation when you were in Iran?
No, fortunately not. But I have a point on that, because I think that the psychology behind the torture is very important. We've been talking about torture in a very technical way, as if we're talking about an automobile. It's what's mostly important for me as a victim of torture is most the ethical side, and how a Canadian would have a lot of difficulty torturing another Canadian, or an American having a lot of difficulty torturing another American. But in their minds, if they differentiate between themselves and the other with a black eye or a brown eye, or far down in the Middle East or Al Qaeda, they might have this psychology easier. And that's the whole point, because we see the guy talking with his wife, but at the same time, and he doesn't distinguish between he's working as a torturer, but at the same time talking with his wife and about his kid. And this is all about the psychology of the torturing.
I was going to ask, Melissa, what is Amnesty trying to do here by showing him on the phone with his little girl?
Well, I think it's in part trying to show his humanity. And the way I read that was that he actually is enduring some suffering of his own. That he has to take that time to step back and kind of square himself to the task that he's confronting, which I think is a really important point. I just finished reading a very important book by Darius Rejali, a political science professor at Reed College, called Torture and Democracy. It's a fantastic book. It's an accumulation of many years of research. One of the points that he makes in the book that I think is extremely important is that the damage that torture does is, first and foremost, to its victims, but also to its perpetrators. And he chronicles the psychological effects of the interrogators who practice torture throughout their lives, the health consequences that they suffer, patterns of abuse and alcoholism that they pass on to their children. So there's an intergenerational harm to them as well as to the victims.
Rick, have you heard about this? Even though it works, and even though the torturer may feel absolutely justified morally in doing what he or she is doing, does it take its toll as much on the perpetrator?
There's only a handful of people in the U.S. government that were authorized to do any of these enhanced interrogation techniques, and they were all in the Central Intelligence Agency. It was very restricted, and Yeah, there were a lot of psychological problems with it. They went through several profiles. It was very problematic for them, and there were a lot of issues afterwards. I agree 100%. I mean, it does take a toll on. Nobody wants to do this. This is not something you sign up for. This is not something you enjoy doing. But at some point, it's like a soldier going into battle. I mean, you realize that maybe this is what you have to do.
What makes for a good interrogator?
I think the best interrogators are people who have an empathy and understanding for the person that they're trying to get information from. And in the vast majority of cases, the easiest way to get information from someone is to be nice to them. And I think a prisoner arrested by a foreign power in jail who can be questioned by someone who speaks his language, who knows his culture, who knows where he came from, who understands him, that's the person who I think is most likely to get information from them. However, there has to be, I think, a calculating aspect to that personality as well. And there are people who become extremely skilled, not just at reading the people they're interviewing, but also manipulating them. And I think that you need a clever, empathetic, calculating individual. Those are your best interrogators.
All of those qualities, but also time as well, right? You have to have a lot of time if you're going to make it work.
Time is a luxury, and most of the time you have it. There are times when you don't, and the methods have to become very blunt. But I think that's, one of the factors that impinges on how to approach somebody.
About a half a year before he ran for the leadership of the Liberal Party of Canada, Michael Ignatieff, who of course now is a member of Parliament for the Liberals, wrote a piece called "If Torture Works" for Prospect magazine. It was a very controversial piece, and he took a lot of heat for it. I want to just read an excerpt from that and then consider what it was that he was trying to say. Michael, if you would, let's bring this up. Clear thinking about torture is not served by collapsing the distinction between coercive interrogation and torture. Both may be repugnant, but repugnance does not make them into the same thing. If coercion and torture are on a moral continuum, at what point on the continuum does queasiness turn to revulsion? Can you answer that question, Rick?
No, that's
tough, isn't it?
Well, that is the big question. Yeah. It's not can you waterboard? It's should you waterboard, and it should you use these techniques? Not can you. So and that line. It's really hard to define.
Well, let's try.
People always say, "Well, what is the difference between coercive when does coercive torture end, and when coercive interrogation end and torture begin?" I don't know. I mean, I have my own thoughts of it. It's like pornography. You can't really define it, but you know it when you see it. I would know torture when I saw it. It's something that causes lasting, permanent physical damage. Like if you look at Senator McCain, obviously he was tortured.
Well, let's go through it. I've got a bit of a list here, and I want to see. Mark, again, I want to start with you. Deception. Tell us the story about the Israeli interrogator, and he's got a row of hooded men in front of him.
Right, and he, none of them can see, and he announces, all right, everybody who is willing to help me, who's willing to cooperate, raise their hands, and we can clear you out of here right away. And he says, okay. There's 7 of you. No one has raised their hand. He says, okay, get these 7, let's get them out of here. And that leaves everyone who isn't, no one comes over to get them, so they think, why am I sitting here, hanging tough when these guys are all getting out? So he found that to be a very effective way of coercing, in some cases, everybody down the hall.
Now, Ramin, is that torture?
Yeah, I think so.
You think that's torture?
Yeah, it could be.
It's very deceptive, but is it torture?
Well, it brings the suffering to the person, the psychological suffering. I think psychological suffering is also part of torture.
Melissa, would that be torture in your book?
I would not. I have not studied these questions enough to have a clear view about where to draw the boundary line, but my intuition is that that is not torture. I think one metric I use in trying to think about this distinction is what we would permit within within criminal interrogation procedures. And I just don't know enough about the place of interrogation in overall criminal investigation procedures.
Okay, we're just trying to figure out. I'm sort of going to survey all of
But
them
that's
here,
one
figure out where
way
the
of
line
drawing
is.
the line is, would that kind of deception be permissible within the Canadian rule of criminal law and in criminal law?
Mark, would you say that was torture, that
No.
deception? No? And I know you wouldn't either.
No, that in fact deception is used by police. It's been upheld several times.
Okay. How about yelling at a detainee? Screaming in his face. Torture?